December 1944. The coldest winter in 30 years descends upon the Ardennes forest like an executioner's blade. Inside a shattered Belgian town, 10,000 American soldiers are completely surrounded by the most powerful war machine ever assembled. They're starving. They're freezing. They're almost out of ammunition. The Germans offer them one chance to surrender with honor, to save their lives. The American commander's response is a single word that will echo through history. But first, they have to survive 7 days in hell. This is the story of Bastogne, where the fate of the world hung by a thread thinner than hope itself. The fog hung over the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16th like a burial shroud, thick and impenetrable, concealing secrets that would soon explode into the bloodiest American battle of the Second World War. Private James Hendricks of the 101st Airborne Division didn't know it yet, but his world was about to collapse. He was huddled in a makeshift barracks near the Belgian town of Bastogne, trying to get warm, trying to forget the jump into Normandy 6 months earlier, trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, the war was winding down. Intelligence said the Germans were finished, broken, retreating toward their homeland like wounded animals seeking their den. The brass had promised them an easy winter. They'd been promised hot meals, dry socks, maybe even a pass to Paris. The first shells came without warning, ripping through the gray morning like the voice of a furious god. The sound was unlike anything the veterans had heard before, not the sporadic artillery of a desperate defense, but a continuous, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Tree bursts sent razor-sharp splinters of wood and metal slicing through the air, transforming the forest into a killing floor where there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Within hours, the unthinkable was happening. German forces, hundreds of thousands of them, supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, were pouring through what had been considered a quiet sector of the Allied line. This wasn't the death rattle of a defeated army. This was Hitler's final, desperate gamble, a massive offensive designed to split the Allied forces in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. The offensive came to be called the Battle of the Bulge, named for the massive bulge it created in Allied lines, but for the men caught in its path, it was simply the moment when hell froze over. The temperature plummeted to depths not seen in 3 decades, turning breath to ice crystals and transforming human flesh into something brittle and foreign. Snow began falling on the 17th, and it didn't stop. It fell in thick, suffocating sheets that erased roads, buried foxholes, and turned the world into an endless white nightmare where friend and foe became gray shadows in the swirling void. Bastogne sat at the center of this maelstrom like a stone in a whirlpool. It was an unremarkable Belgian market town of perhaps 4,000 souls, built around a central square with a church whose spire reached toward heaven as if in supplication. But Bastogne possessed something that made it the most important piece of real estate in Western Europe that winter. 7 roads converged there, 7 vital arteries that connected the entire region. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. Without it, the German offensive would stall, their tanks and troops bottlenecked on secondary routes, vulnerable to counterattack. With it, they could pour through into France, severing supply lines, encircling entire armies, perhaps changing the course of the war itself. The 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles who had jumped into Normandy and fought through Operation Market Garden, found themselves rushed to Bastogne in a desperate attempt to hold the town until reinforcements could arrive. They came in on trucks, moving through roads clogged with refugees and retreating American units, their faces telling stories of unspeakable horror. Entire divisions had been overrun, thousands captured, vehicles abandoned, weapons thrown aside in panic. The men fleeing spoke of tigers and panthers appearing out of the fog like prehistoric monsters, of SS troops showing no mercy, of positions collapsing like houses of cards. Some were wounded, blood frozen to their uniforms in dark patches. Others were simply broken, their eyes holding nothing but a vast, empty terror. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st in the absence of the division's regular commander, surveyed the situation with the cold pragmatism of a man who had seen too much death to indulge in illusions. He was an artilleryman by training, 56 years old, with a face that looked carved from granite and eyes that never seemed to blink. He'd been ordered to hold Bastogne at all costs. A phrase that sounded clean and simple in a conference room but meant something entirely different when you were surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered you 4-1. The 101st numbered around 10,000 men when they arrived, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and various support units that had been swept up in the chaos. Against them came 3 full German divisions, backed by tanks, artillery, and the fanatical determination of men who knew this was their last chance to turn the tide. The encirclement closed on December 20th like a noose. German forces flowed around Bastogne from all directions, cutting the roads one by one, severing the Americans from their supply lines, from reinforcement, from hope. Inside the shrinking perimeter, the defenders dug in. They occupied a rough circle perhaps 4 miles in diameter, anchored on small villages and farms with names that would become soaked in blood. Foy, Bizery, Marvy, Neff. The ground was frozen solid, making digging foxholes an exercise in agony that left hands bleeding and tools broken. Men chipped away at the earth with pickaxes, with bayonets, with helmets, creating shallow scrapes that offered minimal protection from the artillery that began falling with metronomic regularity. The cold was its own enemy, more relentless than any Wehrmacht soldier. It crept through wool uniforms that had seemed adequate in autumn but were laughably insufficient against this Arctic assault. It invaded boots, turning feet into blocks of ice that men couldn't feel, couldn't move, couldn't trust. Frostbite became epidemic. Toes and fingers turned white, then purple, then black, the tissue dying while the man still lived, creating a special kind of horror. Soldiers would wake to find their feet swollen to twice their normal size, unable to fit into their boots, knowing that even if they survived the battle, they might lose their ability to walk. Others suffered from trench foot, a condition where constant dampness and cold caused flesh to rot while still attached to the body, filling the air with the sweet, nauseating smell of decay. Food became memory. The 101st had arrived with minimal supplies, expecting to be relieved within days. When the roads were cut, those expectations died. Rations were cut to 1 meal per day, then half a meal, then whatever could be scavenged from abandoned homes and stores. Men learned to eat snow to fill their stomachs, though it provided no nutrition and lowered body temperature dangerously. They discovered that hunger was not a single sensation but a progression, beginning as an ache, evolving into a constant gnawing pain, finally transforming into a strange lightheadedness where reality seemed to float just beyond reach. Some men became obsessed with food, talking endlessly about meals they'd eaten, meals they would eat, describing in excruciating detail the texture of bread, the smell of coffee, the taste of their mother's cooking. Others stopped talking altogether, conserving energy, retreating into themselves. The wounded presented an impossible equation with no good solution. The 101st had medical personnel, but resources were catastrophically insufficient. Morphine ran out within days. Plasma for blood transfusions disappeared even faster. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. The aid stations, set up in cellars and church crypts to protect from artillery, became chambers of suffering where men lay in rows on stone floors, bleeding, freezing, crying out for help that couldn't come. Surgeons operated by candlelight, amputating frozen limbs without anesthesia, holding men down while they screamed, making decisions about who would receive treatment and who would be left to die because there simply weren't enough hands, enough supplies, enough hours in the day. Dr. Jack Pryor, a battalion surgeon from Ohio, worked until he could no longer feel his own hands, until exhaustion made him hallucinate, until he found himself weeping over a boy who reminded him of his son, while other boys waited their turn to die. He had become a doctor to save lives, but in Bastogne he became a sorter of the dying, a manager of agony, a man who went to sleep each night knowing that his best efforts were never enough, could never be enough. The wounded kept coming, carried in on stretchers or dragging themselves through the snow, leaving red trails behind them like snails leave silver. Some arrived already dead, frozen in the positions they'd held when hit, their bodies rigid and impossible to straighten. Others died while waiting, their blood pressure dropping, their hearts giving out, their last words disappearing into the din of artillery and small arms fire. The civilians of Bastogne were caught in this maelstrom through no fault of their own. Most had stayed when the Americans arrived, believing their town would be liberated and protected. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a siege, their homes transformed into fortifications, their cellars filled with soldiers and wounded. Marie Lebrun, a schoolteacher in her 30s, spent those days caring for children in a basement beneath the church, trying to shield them from the sounds of battle that penetrated even those ancient stones. She rationed bread that grew smaller each day, sang songs to drown out the screams from the aid station above, told stories of brave knights and rescued princesses to children who were learning that reality contained no such mercies. Some of the children cried constantly. Others became eerily silent, their faces blank, already understanding at 6 or 7 years old that the world was a place of random violence and that survival was a matter of luck rather than justice. The German attacks came in waves, testing the American defenses, probing for weakness, gradually tightening the noose. Panzer tanks rolled through nearby villages, their treads crushing cobblestones, their guns demolishing buildings to flush out defenders. Infantry followed, soldiers of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, who attacked with a desperation born of knowing this was Germany's last offensive action, that after this came only retreat and defeat. They came through the snow in their winter camouflage, appearing as ghosts until they were close enough to kill, firing machine guns and lobbing grenades, fighting with the skill of men who had been at war for 5 years. The 101st fought back with everything they had, which grew less with each passing hour. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that men were told not to fire unless they had a clear target, not to waste a single bullet on suppressive fire or nervous shots into the darkness. Machine gunners counted their belts like misers counting gold, knowing that once the last round was fired, their positions would be overrun. Artillery, the great equalizer of modern warfare, fell silent as shells ran out. By Christmas Eve, some batteries had exactly 4 rounds remaining. 4 shots to stop a German assault that might come with tanks and hundreds of infantry. The math was simple and terrifying. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a message, typed neatly on paper, addressed to the American commander. The message was courteous, almost gentle in its phrasing. It acknowledged the bravery of the American defense, noted the hopelessness of the American position, and offered honorable terms of surrender. The soldiers would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, would be given food and medical care, would survive the war. Refusal would result in total annihilation. The ultimatum was clear: surrender or die. The message was brought to General McAuliffe in his command post, a damp basement that smelled of mold and cordite. He read it once, then looked at his staff officers, their faces gaunt from hunger and lack of sleep, their eyes holding the knowledge that the German assessment was accurate. They were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of everything needed to sustain a defense. Logic dictated surrender. Pragmatism suggested saving the lives that could still be saved. But McAuliffe was not a logical man in that moment, not pragmatic, not interested in the calculus of survival. He was a soldier who had been told to hold Bastogne, and hold it he would until he was dead or the Germans were defeated. His response entered military legend instantly. When asked what reply should be sent, McAuliffe uttered a single word, a piece of American slang that perfectly captured his contempt for the German ultimatum: nuts. His staff initially thought he was joking, that he would compose a formal military response. But McAuliffe was deadly serious. That was his answer, complete and final. When the German officers received the typed reply, a single word on a white page, they were confused, uncertain if it was a code or some technical term they didn't understand. An American officer explained, it meant go to hell. The story of McAuliffe's response spread through the American lines like wildfire, transforming morale in an instant. Men who had been on the edge of despair found themselves laughing, actually laughing in their frozen foxholes, at the sheer audacity of it. Nuts. The general had told the entire Wehrmacht to go to hell with a single syllable. If he believed they could hold, if he had that much confidence or that much insanity, then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The psychology of siege warfare shifted in that moment. The defenders were no longer simply waiting to be overrun. They were making a stand, drawing a line, declaring that this ground would not be surrendered regardless of the cost. The Germans responded the way cornered animals respond, with fury and violence. Artillery fire intensified to levels that defied comprehension, hundreds of shells per hour falling on positions that were already pulverized, cratering the frozen earth, filling the air with shrapnel and smoke and the screams of men who were being torn apart. The bombardments came mostly at night, transforming darkness into a flickering hell of orange flashes and shadows that danced like demons. Men learned to tell the type of incoming round by its sound. The shriek of the 88mm, the deeper roar of the 105mm, the freight train rumble of the massive 170mm guns that could obliterate a building with a single hit. They learned to throw themselves flat at the first whistle, to press their bodies into the earth as if they could melt into it, to pray to gods they'd forgotten in a bargain that was always the same. Let me survive this one, just this one, and I'll never ask for anything again. But the shells kept coming, and the prayers went unanswered, and men died in ways that left nothing to send home. Their bodies disintegrated into red mist and scattered fragments. Others survived the blasts but were broken in ways that couldn't be seen. Their minds fractured by the constant expectation of death, by the randomness of survival, by the guilt of living when the man beside them was killed. Shell shock, battle fatigue, combat stress reaction, the doctors had various names for it, but the soldiers called it simply breaking. Men would suddenly stop functioning, staring into nothing, unable to move or speak. Others became hysterical, laughing or crying uncontrollably, babbling about home or God or begging to be shot to end the torment. Some wandered away from their positions in a daze and were found hours later, frozen solid, having walked in circles until the cold took them. Christmas Eve arrived with no change in the weather, no cessation of hostilities, no miracle to mark the birth of the Prince of Peace. In Bastogne's cellars and crypts, in foxholes and ruined buildings, men who had been raised with Christmas as a day of joy and family found themselves instead in the coldest, darkest place they'd ever been. Some sang carols, their voices thin and cracking in the frigid air, the familiar melodies sounding strange and sad in this context. Silent Night became an elegy. O Come All Ye Faithful became a desperate plea. Chaplains moved through the positions offering what comfort they could, though words felt inadequate against the reality of frozen feet and empty stomachs and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more death. Marie Lebrun gathered the children in her basement sanctuary and led them in singing, her voice strong even as her heart broke for what these little ones were experiencing, for the childhood being stolen from them in these dark days. She told them the story of the first Christmas, of a baby born in difficult circumstances, of hope arriving in the darkest hour. The children listened with solemn faces, old beyond their years, understanding metaphor in ways they shouldn't have to. When she finished, the smallest child, a boy of perhaps 5 whose parents had been killed in the first days of shelling, asked her a question that she would remember for the rest of her life. If God sent Jesus to save us, will he send someone to save us too? She had no answer that didn't feel like a lie. But even as that child asked his question, something was happening that would indeed feel like salvation, though it came not from heaven but from the south, and it came not riding clouds of glory but driving through snow and mud in tanks and trucks, fighting every mile of the way. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, had received orders to turn his entire force 90 degrees north and drive toward Bastogne to break the siege. It was a maneuver of staggering complexity, requiring the movement of hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of vehicles through winter conditions that made normal military operations nearly impossible. Patton had boasted he could do it in 48 hours. His staff thought he was insane. But Patton was a man possessed, driven by ego and ambition and a genuine respect for the soldiers trapped in Bastogne. He would get there, he promised, or die trying. The Third Army's drive north became its own epic of suffering and determination. Roads that appeared on maps didn't exist on the ground, covered by 3 feet of snow or transformed into rivers of freezing mud. Tanks threw their treads in the cold, engines seized, fuel lines froze solid. Men pushed vehicles by hand when machines failed, their boots slipping on ice, their muscles screaming, frostbite claiming fingers and toes even as they worked. German forces fought desperate rearguard actions, knowing that if Patton broke through, the entire Bulge offensive would collapse. Every town became a battlefield, every bridge a choke point defended to the death. American soldiers who thought they'd seen hard fighting in France discovered new depths of exhaustion and misery as they attacked through blizzards, advanced over fields of ice, fought house to house in villages where every window held a sniper. Back in Bastogne, the defenders had no idea if relief was coming, no confirmation that anyone even knew they were still fighting. Radio communication was sporadic, dependent on batteries that were dying in the cold. The siege entered its 7th day, and then its 8th, and conditions that had seemed unbearable somehow grew worse. Men standing watch in foxholes fell asleep from exhaustion despite the cold, and some didn't wake up, the final sleep claiming them so gently they never knew it arrived. Others, delirious from hunger and fatigue, saw things that weren't there, German tanks that turned out to be shadows, reinforcements that materialized from wishes, phantom sounds of aircraft engines bringing supplies that never came. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, owned the skies above Bastogne. Thick clouds and snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft, preventing resupply drops and close air support. German planes flew reconnaissance missions with impunity, counting American positions, directing artillery fire, dropping bombs on the town center that added to the already catastrophic destruction. Buildings collapsed into rubble, streets became impassable canyons filled with frozen debris. Fires burned that couldn't be extinguished because the water mains had frozen solid. The town that had been home to 4,000 souls was being systematically erased from the map, and the people who remained huddled in its bowels could only wait and pray and wonder if they would see another dawn. Then, on December 23rd, something impossible happened. The weather broke. The clouds that had covered the Ardennes for days suddenly parted, revealing a sky of crystalline blue so brilliant it hurt to look at. Within hours, the drone of aircraft engines filled the air, but this time they were American engines, the beautiful sound of salvation. C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne in formations so large they darkened the sun, and from their bellies fell hundreds of parachutes, red and white and blue silk blossoms against the winter sky, each one carrying supplies that meant the difference between continued resistance and collapse. The drop zones had been marked with orange panels, but some of the cargo fell outside the perimeter into German-held territory, leading to desperate firefights as both sides tried to recover the precious supplies. But enough got through. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, the very things that had been exhausted now arrived in quantities that seemed miraculous. Soldiers who had been rationing single rounds now had full magazines. Surgeons received plasma and morphine and bandages. Men opened boxes of K-rations with shaking hands and ate mechanically, their stomachs shrunken from days of deprivation, some getting violently ill from the sudden influx of food. The aerial resupply did more than provide material resources. It proved that they had not been forgotten, that the world beyond the siege knew they were fighting, that someone cared enough to send help despite the risks. The transport pilots flew through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of explosive, through conditions that would have grounded civilian aircraft, accepting losses they knew were coming because the men on the ground needed them. Some planes were shot down, spinning into the frozen earth in balls of flame, their crews dying so that the defenders of Bastogne might live. Their sacrifice was not discussed or debated. It simply was another entry in the ledger of costs being paid in this frozen corner of Belgium. The clear weather also brought fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts that screamed out of the sun to attack German positions with bombs, rockets, and machine guns. Suddenly, the Wehrmacht forces surrounding Bastogne found themselves under constant aerial assault. Their tanks destroyed, their supply columns strafed, their troop concentrations scattered. The psychological impact was profound. For days, the Germans had been the hammer and the Americans the anvil. Now the roles reversed. American soldiers watched German vehicles burn and felt something like joy, something like vengeance, something that tasted of hope. On December 26th, the sound of artillery changed. Instead of incoming rounds falling on American positions, the defenders heard outgoing fire, heavy guns firing from the south, getting closer with each salvo. Word spread through the lines like electricity. Patton was coming. The Third Army was breaking through. At 1,650 hours, elements of the 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's drive, made contact with American defenders on the southern edge of the perimeter. The siege was broken. The relief column that entered Bastogne was barely recognizable as the proud formation that had started north days earlier. Tanks were scarred and battered, covered in mud and ice, many running on nothing but fumes because supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The soldiers riding them were hollow-eyed and exhausted, having fought continuously for 96 hours, but they were grinning, actually grinning, because they'd done it, they'd reached Bastogne, they'd saved the screaming eagles. The defenders who stumbled out to meet them looked like scarecrows dressed in American uniforms, gaunt and ragged and bearing the marks of their ordeal in every hollow cheek and thousand-yard stare. They embraced like brothers, these men who had never met before, united by the simple fact that they had all survived what should have killed them. But the battle was not over. Breaking the siege was not the same as winning the battle. German forces still surrounded Bastogne on three sides, still attacked with desperate fury, still trying to cut the narrow corridor that Patton had opened. The fighting continued through the end of December and into January. Brutal close-quarters combat in snow-covered forests where visibility was measured in yards and death came from directions you never saw. The 101st Airborne, reinforced now but still bearing the scars of the siege, fought on with a grim determination born of knowing what was at stake. They had held when holding seemed impossible. They would not surrender that achievement now. The cost was written in blood and bodies. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January, the 101st Airborne had suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing, most of whom would never be found, their bodies lost in the snow or buried in mass graves or simply erased by artillery fire. These numbers, precise and clinical, represented shattered families, unfulfilled dreams, and potential that would never be realized. Each number was a person who had lived and loved and hoped, who had believed in something worth fighting for, who had paid the ultimate price in a frozen Belgian town most had never heard of before December 1944. The wider battle consumed 75,000 Allied casualties, making it the bloodiest single engagement in U.S. Army history, surpassing even the great battles of the Civil War in absolute numbers. The Germans lost even more, approximately 100,000 casualties, losses they could not replace, consuming the last reserves of manpower and material that might have prolonged the war. Hitler's gamble had failed completely. Not only had the offensive not reached Antwerp, it hadn't even secured Bastogne, the very first objective. The strategic situation was now worse for Germany than before the attack, with the Wehrmacht exhausted, the Luftwaffe decimated, fuel reserves depleted, and the Eastern Front collapsing under Soviet pressure. The psychological impact of Bastogne resonated far beyond the tactical situation. It proved that American forces could stand and fight against the best the Wehrmacht could offer, could take punishment that should have broken any formation, could hold ground against impossible odds through nothing but sheer determination and courage. The soldiers who fought there became symbols of resilience, exemplars of the American spirit that refused to quit even when quitting was the only rational choice. McAuliffe's "nuts" response became a rallying cry, a declaration that some things mattered more than survival, that dignity and duty and honor were not empty words but principles worth dying for. Marie Lebrun emerged from her basement sanctuary when the guns finally fell silent, leading her children into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The town she had known, with its market square and church and houses where families had lived for generations, existed now only in memory. What remained was rubble and ruin, buildings reduced to broken walls, streets cratered and impassable, a desolation that looked like the end of the world. But life, that stubborn force that persists even in the darkest times, was already reasserting itself. People emerged from cellars like creatures from burrows, blinking in the winter light, checking on neighbors, beginning the impossible task of rebuilding. The children played in the ruins, because children always find ways to play, even among the debris of war. The soldiers who survived carried Bastogne with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke about it endlessly, processing trauma through repetition, trying to make sense of something that defied sense. Others never mentioned it at all, locking those memories away in vaults they would never open, believing that to speak of such things was to allow them power they no longer deserved. They went home to America, to small towns and big cities, to families who could never fully understand what they had experienced, to lives that seemed impossibly mundane after the intensity of combat. Some adjusted, finding purpose in work and family and the simple pleasures of peace. Others struggled, haunted by nightmares and survivor's guilt and the question that never has a satisfactory answer. Why did I live when they died? Dr. Jack Pryor returned to his practice in Ohio, delivering babies and treating illnesses and performing surgeries in clean, well-lit hospitals where he had all the supplies he needed. He never spoke to his patients about Bastogne, never mentioned that he'd once operated on boys while artillery fell around him, that he'd made choices about who would live and die based on nothing but instinct and inadequate information. But sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he would remember those boys, would recall their faces with perfect clarity, would wonder if he'd made the right decisions, if a different choice would have saved one more life. The question was unanswerable, but it haunted him nonetheless. Bastogne became a pilgrimage site for those who survived and for the families of those who didn't. They came in the years after the war, walking the streets that had been battlefields, standing in foxholes that were now being reclaimed by grass and trees, trying to understand what had happened in this place. Memorials were erected, museums established, ceremonies held each December to remember the siege and honor the fallen. The town rebuilt itself, creating something new on the foundations of what had been destroyed. But it never forgot. How could it? Its streets were named for American units. Its buildings bore plaques explaining what happened where. Its very existence was testimony to the price paid for its liberation. The Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The offensive consumed resources that could never be replaced, killed soldiers who could never be conscripted again, destroyed equipment that German factories could no longer produce. Hitler had gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice, believing that if he could just split the Allies, just create enough chaos and defeat, the Western powers would sue for peace and Germany could focus on the Soviet threat. He was wrong. The Western Allies were not broken, were not discouraged, were if anything more determined than ever to see the war through to unconditional surrender. By January 1945, Allied forces were pushing into Germany itself, and the Red Army was sweeping across Poland toward Berlin. The end, when it came in May, was inevitable, made so in part by what happened in Bastogne. Today, Bastogne stands as a symbol, its name synonymous with courage under fire, with the refusal to quit when quitting seems reasonable, with the stubborn resilience that defines the human spirit at its best. The men who fought there were not superhuman. They were ordinary people, farmers and factory workers and shopkeepers, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to stand rather than break. They were cold and hungry and afraid, experienced doubt and despair, saw horrors that no person should witness. But they held. Against logic, against odds, against everything that suggested surrender was the only option. They held. The lesson of Bastogne is not that war is glorious or noble or anything other than the catastrophic failure of human civilization to resolve its differences peacefully. The lesson is simpler and more profound, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when something larger than themselves is at stake. The soldiers at Bastogne were fighting for many things, for their country, for their comrades, for the people trapped in the cellars beneath them, but perhaps most fundamentally, they were fighting for the idea that tyranny and aggression should not be allowed to triumph simply because the cost of opposing them is high. In our modern world, where comfort is assumed and hardship is something that happens to other people in other places, Bastogne reminds us that freedom is neither free nor guaranteed. It is purchased with sacrifice, defended with courage, and maintained through the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when called upon. The foxholes are empty now, filled in by time and weather. The buildings have been rebuilt, the streets repaved, the scars of battle healed. But the memory remains, preserved not just in monuments and museums, but in the collective understanding that some things matter enough to fight for. Some ground is worth holding. Some battles must be won regardless of the cost. 341 American soldiers died at Bastogne, along with countless civilians caught in the crossfire. Their names are inscribed on memorials. Their bodies rest in cemeteries where white crosses stretch in perfect rows. Their sacrifice is remembered each December when veterans and dignitaries gather to lay wreaths and speak words of gratitude. But beyond the formal commemorations, beyond the ceremonies and speeches, their legacy lives in a simpler truth. When it mattered most, in the coldest winter in 30 years, surrounded and outnumbered and nearly out of everything, they stood. And because they stood, the world changed. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and impossible odds has moved you, please consider subscribing to this channel to hear more untold stories from history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And here's a question to consider. What do you think was the single most crucial factor that allowed the 101st Airborne to hold Bastogne against such overwhelming odds? Was it leadership, supply drops, sheer determination, or something else entirely? Thank you for watching, and remember those who stood in the snow so that we might live in peace.